Hello, TAMS users. This is part 2 of our discussion of select, near, and co-occurrence. So in the first part, we looked at co-occurrence as being the sharing of some context variable, usually time. But it could be any context variable that gathers together values related to each other. We're going to expand that using select near. With select near, we can ask questions like how many rows away, how many codes are 5 rows away from these codes? How many rows are 2 minutes away from these codes? And TAMS is very smart about time. If you use the insert time and any form, either seconds or hour, minute, seconds, it will convert between them. It looks for those colons in there and does conversion. So select near, I'm going to pull it up and then make it go away. Select near takes one set, the current selection, compares it to a second set. You can limit which codes in that second set you want to look at, and then ask for a definition of near. All right, so the ideal way to use this is to have some sub-selection, and to start with, we'll do our good friend narrative. So there are our 8 narrative records, and we're going to find things that are 1 minute away from these rows. Obviously, that's a bigger set than merely the ones that share the time codes here, because it could be an earlier time code, 30 seconds earlier, or 30 seconds later. So we want anything within that kind of minute of that. So we go select near. And we'll take all codes and we'll compare the current selection to all records. We want things in only the same file, so if there's a 128 in a different file, that doesn't count. That's not the same 128. What is near defined as? Well, I'm going to define it as 30 seconds before and after. And I'm going to urge you to click this as well. It will automatically use whatever value of time is in your preference file. See how time code is time? So it would use it. But by default, it's actually underscore time. I've changed it here. So I want to make sure it gets the right message. So I'm going to tell it it's time and seconds. The fact is you could put seconds, minutes, hours. It will understand that it is time. All right. So comparing time in seconds, we're less than or equal seconds and before or after. And you can see the options there. Let's see what we get. We're going to get an outline view. And all 8 rows have some record before or after. And you can see it's a much bigger set than we got when we were just doing select overlapped. Of course, I don't want to individually look at this stuff. I want a report telling me what I've got. So I come here to graph chart hierarchical data. I've got my level 1s with the triangle. Well, we'll do code. And we'll start with a table. And I always check all of those, at least as a first draft. I'll compare it with codes to start with, and let's see what I've got. So these are codes before and after. So there I've got a nice count and subcount of the codes before and after, but this has gathered it across all files. I may want this broken down by instance. To do that, what I'm going to do is add the time code here on the level 1 codes. So I want time, but I want time following my code. So I drag it, I can rearrange it, and it's kind of a clunky drag and drop mechanism, but there we go. I keep on not getting it in exactly the spot I want. There we go. So now I've got code and time. I use the Apple key to extend and unextend against code. Let's see what we got here. So now I've got it broken down. Of course, I still run into the problem that 516 may be in two different files, or even more, 820, and maybe these are in different files. I better do something about that. I'm going to add doc to the mix. So I've got three codes here. Generate the report, and now I know it has separated it out by file, by time, and so forth. Now, so now I have a breakdown of narrative and which things overlap each instance. I could look at what things are near narrative overall. I could look at what things are close to narrative by gender. So maybe I'm exploring whether gender affects what codes are near. So I mess around with it till I can get gender and code together. Click code here, generate the report. So now I just have two nice things, and I can do a comparison. I've got these singletons here, and a much more complex set of things around narrative on the women's side. So that's kind of interesting. Maybe significant or not, you will have to explore and try to falsify questions like that. But it does help get at this just by clicking different options here. Similarly, I could, for code, break things down by file name. Now, I'm going to drop it under code there. So I've got code and file name. I could use doc instead of file name. Doc is probably actually more reliable. I just happen to know that there is an exclamation mark name tag in every file here, so I'm not going to run into problems. Why did I go to all that bother of putting code first? Because I wanted this column, column 2, the level 2s, sorted by code, not by file name. So now I can see, for example, capacity is Justin Zander. Example is in Amy, Cindy, and Zander. The negatives are in Amy, Erica, and Zander's files. All right, so that gives you a handle on selecting near, before, and after. I'm going to go back to my select near report, and that means I have to twiddle this back to table view. So I'm back at table view, I'm picking select near, and I want to show you some of the other options. So I have seconds before, but I could do minutes, days, lines, characters. If I'm doing line, I have to make sure that there's a line number column in my results. You have to really use the line numbers, or if you're doing it yourself, definitely use the options to compare a specific field. Each of these is programmed to kind of make an assumption about where to look. Characters, for instance, uses this column over here, bare location. Bare location is an index into of where that row begins if there were no tags anywhere in the file. Begin location is the actual character location, starting with the first character in the file, where that row really begins. This one does that calculation as if there are no tags anywhere in the file. That's the bare part of it. So it's helpful to know that the characters is looking at bare location, lines is looking at line number, which is automatically generated if you have it, and these are using your time codes here. But you can always force it to look at some other field by clicking that column here and then telling it what kind of data it's handling there. All right, so now we have a much broader way of looking at how rows are related to each other. We don't just have to look at ones that overlap, ones that share a specific value. We can also define nearness in the select near and use that to identify relevant and related rows. So that almost ends our discussion of how to find rows that are related to each other. But I want to do one more thing, which is actually moving us to our next discussion, which is how can we find out relationships between our context rows and our data rows. And it's kind of in a gray zone of whether it falls into that video or this one, so I thought I'd wrap up with this one. And it's a very simple function. Here I am in table view. I'm going to select all. I can group any column, and that's going to create its own outline view. And it will use the current selection to do that grouping. So for example, I may want to be looking at positive reasons for using literature. So I've got all my positive readings, and you can see I've got a ton of subcodes here. But I'd like those subcodes grouped. Now, I could just sort out, and that will certainly put them this way, but it's not giving me any sort of a count or anything. So I select the column I want to group on. And now I'm going to group that column so that these things are gathered and counted. So I come here to my results menu. I slide down to group column. It doesn't ask me anything. It simply gathers everything in the current selection and puts them under separate titles. So there's no redundancy here. If equity is here, there's no other equities. All the equity stuff is underneath it. Or here, I can see that there are 10 positive motivations, and the count is always put in the data column of the level ones, and the values are always put in the code column. It's just coincidence that these actually are codes, and I'll show you what I mean in a second. So here are all of the related codes that share that value. And of course, I can do a graph hierarchical table. For my level ones, there's only two things worth including: data and code, or code and data. Then you pick what you want to look at in the subsequent column, and I of course can rearrange all of these things. So I may want file name and code, or file name and time. We'll do that. Where's file name? There we go. That looks good to me. Let's take a look at what that report looks like. So I've got my level ones, and it tells me it has each of those values and then lists underneath who and where that code is used. So again, this really is connecting different types of variables. It's really connecting my context codes with my data codes. But it's also letting me, for instance, look at relationships between data codes. So for instance, I may not really be interested in file name. I might want to see the data itself. I'm going to drag data way up on my list here, stick it at the top, and the file name and the time. And if I generate that report, I can use this to browse my data. Now this is not hot linked back to the table, but it does make a fairly good report for reading. Now, as I'll show you in the next video, there are other ways of getting this exact data with even more options, and in some ways it could even be more readable than this. But this does get some data code comparisons for you gathered by one column. Now I just want to show you something I mentioned earlier, which is if I go back to the table view, I can gather any of these columns. So let's gather these positive reasons by whose reasons they are. So I'm going to come to my results. I'm going to group my column. So now you see, instead of the codes listed under code, you have the values of the column we selected, in this case file name. So those have been put for level 1 only under the code column, and data contains the count again. Underneath, you have regular result window rows with all the context variables in the right place. So the level 1s are clearly being treated very differently than the level 2s when you pick group column. Code always contains the values of the column you selected. Data always contains the count, which is why when you come to this report, on the level 1s, it only makes sense to include code and/or data. This concludes my discussion of how to analyze data codes' relationship to data codes. The next video is going to focus on context codes and their relationship to data codes.